Welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast, brought to you by FingerLakes1.com. It's been a long week. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by Jackie Augustine. We're here in the FingerLakes1.com studio, episode number 24, and boy, it's been a busy week. It's been a busy 2 weeks. Some really interesting headlines have popped up. My wonderful co-host here has even become part of the headlines, I guess, as of the last 24 hours.
Yeah. Not intentionally.
I guess we'll be talking about that later, but we do have some questions, finally, questions from readers. The last couple episodes, we've been kind of busy and haven't had time to...
I'm glad we're getting to them, because it's good when people submit questions. I want to...
So, and they're themed toward the primaries that are coming up.
Okay.
And I thought it was fitting because I think this will be our last podcast before the congressional primaries that are coming up. So yeah, without further ado, let's jump into that. Mark from Geneva asks, have either of your opinions changed about the primary contest between Cynthia Nixon and Governor Cuomo?
I don't think mine has changed. I mean, I'm still not totally, I don't find either of the candidacies particularly compelling. Neither of them are my first choice candidates. And I don't know. I mean, I think that, I think Governor Cuomo will manage to stave off any challenge, but I absolutely think that Cynthia Nixon's candidacy has raised some important issues. I mean, even I just got an email from Brian Kolb's office today that there's a new effort to push forward with some like transparency legislation that was related directly to economic development stuff, which of course is important, especially given that news about those trials that are going on. But overall, if people are talking about ethics in government more, that's a win. So yeah, that's good.
I think to some degree it's worked. Her candidacy has worked. I think it's an issues based. So if the goal was to bring Governor Cuomo further left or to a certain place on issues, I don't want to necessarily say just left, but to a certain place on certain issues, I think that's worked because I have seen a change just in terms of a lot of what he has been doing is more or seems more reactionary than, proactive in terms of, what policies he's pushing forward and what he's talking about. It is kind of a valuable piece of time. If time were real estate, this is like the boardwalk. You get that like 4 or 5 month run up to the general election, right? Especially here in the Finger Lakes, you had him, Cuomo came out and, openly opposed the incinerator.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody, especially given the, we'll call it, I guess, laziness around the Crestwood debate and issue. So for him to come out on this one and to talk about the incinerator the way he did, I think that was a direct result of her. So, maybe there are a few more people who are going to vote and will vote for Nixon, but I still don't think she's going to win. But my curiosity is, does she do enough damage to him to give the Republican challenger, who can cross over, in my opinion, and capture a lot of middle-of-the-road Democrats? Does she do enough damage to Cuomo to make Molinaro an even greater threat to Cuomo's would-be third term?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible, because I think that he's picked up on a lot of the same themes, which is interesting, because when you say you don't want to make it into just like a pushing Cuomo to the left, I think you're right, because Molinaro, I don't think anyone would say that he's going too far to the left, but he's picking up the same themes. So I think people are starting to understand, like, there are serious issues with the way state government is run, and either Cuomo's really going to take that up seriously, or he's going to be open to a very serious challenge in the general election.
Yeah. Charles from Naples asks, what are your thoughts on the congressional primaries, particularly the 23rd district? Are there any that you're looking at with particular interest? There's like 3 questions wrapped into that one.
Yeah,
I'm particularly interested in the 23rd district race, just because I think this is one of the districts where Reed might have been more comfortable given the makeup of the district, the voter makeup of the district. But Democrats had and have a real opportunity to put someone forward who really does fall into that sort of middle ground that can capture some of those Republicans. Will they do it? I don't know. I have my doubts because primaries, unfortunately, from just looking at recent history, even dominated by Ithaca, Geneva, in our district, Corning, places like that, where the scales are tipped heavily further to the left, and thus the candidate who makes it out of a primary under those circumstances, in my opinion, is just going to be naturally somebody who is more left-leaning.
Yeah, I think that might be true, but I mean, here's the thing. I think people are waking up to the fact that Tom Reed has not served the district well. So I think there's a general kind of growing understanding that while he is on the national stage, aligning himself with Trump and working through the channels to make his kind of name known as on the national level, the kind of constituent service and actual connection to the needs of the district have been missing. Lots of his policies have been totally disconnected with what people actually need. But it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the primary. I mean, in full disclosure, I have been backing Ian Golden. I think he, I wouldn't say because he's the moderate candidate. I would say it's because I think that he's a sensible candidate who actually understands how these issues are affecting the district and has been able to communicate that effectively to people. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I've also thought that Tracy Matrano's doing a great job too. So we'll just see, what happens. I think there are some candidates that aren't going to emerge from the primary because I think people are looking not just at the issues but also electability. So I think
my curiosity. So I looking at that through the same lens. My curiosity is: are they looking for? Because it seems to be you have 2 sort of palettes of candidates. You have modern and sort of old school. And what's going to emerge out of that? To me, Tracy Matrano feels more old school. Despite some of her more modern technological background, I think that's helpful. But Ian Golden is a very modern-feeling candidate, refreshing in a lot of ways. I think especially to some moderate Republicans who might be on the fence.
Right. Well, and I think that, his small business credentials definitely pull along some more moderate Republicans who understand just kind of the dollars and cents issues that, again, there's no left or right. It's just right. I mean, there's just what works for the district and what doesn't. And I think there's a near unanimous consensus that Reed is not working for the district. The question is, can people, stomach saying, okay, well, that means I'm not going to vote for a Republican this time. I think there are enough people who are willing to vote in their own interests, but we'll see. So
our last question is interesting, Greg. I laughed when I saw it come in. It came in yesterday afternoon sometime. Greg in Auburn says, I know you guys don't always talk about national politics, but what is your sense of the meeting that took place between Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump? And I thought to myself, why not add this? This is one of those, we never, ever touch on these kinds of things. And, my personal sense is that it isn't really that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, I don't think, unfortunately. Until, this is one of those meetings that I think it's going to take years to even understand what the ripple effect was from it.
Right.
Maybe something good can come of it. but my guess is probably nothing will really come of it. It'll just kind of be like maybe things will be a little less noisy and more just kind of like everybody staying in their own backyard and less, sort of this war of weird words between the two of them, like what we saw last year.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that the U.S. really got anything out of this meeting because, I mean, it didn't, as you said, nothing immediate comes from it. Andy Borowitz from the New York Times had a really funny comment, which I guess just kind of summarizes my views, which was the big question today is how Kim Jong-un is going to spend Trump's lunch money. I thought that was very funny. So anyway,
we see things like this all the time, and maybe sometime we'll actually dedicate an episode to talking about some of these broader, more national, global issues, if that's something that, if we start to see more of these types of questions come through. But just, it was interesting, and I saw it, and I laughed, and I was like, of course, because it was on every TV set. Right, it was everywhere.
And it's not that we don't have opinions about national issues. It's just so many people talk about and analyze that, but, we need something that does that for local and state stuff.
Yeah, and it's really hard to bridge that connection between why that matters. So our first actual topic of the day, really, really interesting report, in my opinion. An investigative report by WHEC determined that in the 4 years since Butler Correctional Facility, which is located in the town of Butler in Wayne County, it was shut down by New York State, and it's cost, give or take, about $350,000 annually to maintain the property, maintain in its desolate, empty, yard not mowed state. So basically, like, to pay the bills, to make sure it doesn't fall apart, keep the gas and water and things like that running. So more than $1 million was spent over that period. And Empire State Development's Real Estate and Planning Department said in that report that a competitive RFP process is necessary and that it's starting, but conceded that the only reason that the RFP process has begun is because interest was vocalized by a few people who may be interested in developing said property. Right. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it was because given that, it's kind of a weird balance to strike if you're an economic development person. If you're supposed to be the gatekeeper of fairness in terms of economic development, and you're saying that the only reason why you're now entering an RFP process 4 years removed from its closure is because there is interest from a couple parties, it sort of paints a picture that maybe there's a little bit of unfair advantage to those couple people who may be interested. And I guess we see this all the time in sort of like this quiet, behind the scenes way. But the RFP process, obviously necessary. But if one of those, if there were ever a way to determine outright who those parties were that were interested or that expressed interest, if one of those ended up being the one that was selected after the RFP process played out, that would be a really ugly mess for Empire State Development to have to clean up, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of it does happen a lot because, I mean, let me play devil's advocate on behalf of the state or any local government, right? If you're managing a lot of properties, sometimes it doesn't occur to you that maybe other people would be interested in something like a moderate security or minimum security facility. So then if some developer starts kind of poking around and saying, hey, we're interested in this for some private use. I mean, it's one thing if it would be like a public use or some public benefit, but if it's a private use, for-profit use, then you really do have to stop and say, I mean, what would be really wrong would be to just sell it to them, right? You have to go through a process. So at that point, the only question is, how do you structure an RFP so that you actually are allowing people to compete for it. So you could just do window dressing and have an RFP that only gets put up on the website. And you know that only the person who's interested is looking at the website, and the turnaround time's 30 days, so nobody else could even have time to conceive of a project. No one else would be able to produce the kind of bid documents you would need. That would be sketchy. But if they're doing a full RFP and they're kind of going out through various outlets, they should have an established set of news and media outlets that they make this available. Then, I can't fault them if at the end of the day, if the group that was initially interested ends up being the bidder. That's how it goes. I mean, that's how public procurement goes. But I agree with you that it's unfortunate that this is how it happens. That it's not until somebody says, "Hey, we want to do something," that it kickstarts this whole process.
Well, and that's if that is the goal and the reason of Empire State Development, to ensure that these types of things are happening. Why didn't this happen 4 years ago? Why didn't this happen 3 or 2 years ago? I mean, $1 million of taxpayer dollars is a whole lot of money to spend to just basically keep the lights on and the water flowing to a vacant property that really, I think, aside from just wiping the property clean, which someone could in theory do, I'm going to assume that part of the RFP is going to request that there's repurposing happening of current existing structures or something to that effect. Maybe that would even be part of a sensible plan just in terms of keeping costs down. But I look at it as there's a great opportunity to have a substance use disorder treatment facility, more beds. That's something that this region needs really badly. And of course, there are a lot of other, if a corporation wants to come in and create some sort of manufacturing, great, that would be awesome too. But my concern would be that when we go back and we look at a lot of these different economic development projects, in particular, I'm going to go to Rochester and I'm going to say the Medley Center.
Okay.
Everybody understands and seen what has happened, the slow sort of decline and grind of that property. On the upswing now, hopefully, but you go through this RFP process, and what promises or assurances do you really have that the plan is going to be followed and executed?
Right. Oh, yeah.
That's always my concern.
That's another question. Once they're actually awarding the bids, there has to be some kind of security, some kind of performance bond, some kind of assurance to people that the project is going to happen as proposed within the timeline specified. And that if it's not, if there are significant misses, that there are these kind of, the public entity has to be the gatekeeper. They have to be looking at it and saying, we're not going to let this get too far afield before we can reel it back in and say, nope, this is what we wanted you to do, this is what you said you would do, and now you're required to do that, or return the property, a portion of the investment, whatever they determine would be an adequate way to make them whole before they have to go through the process all over again.
A separate debate, but something that I guess just kind of popped into my head. Do you think that's something that should exist, like at the very basic fundamental level, instead of having to sort of deal with these issues on a case-by-case basis, to essentially say, this is the way this process is handled, period? If an economic developer or if an interested party has a bid accepted and they do not meet X, Y, and Z criteria, obviously it would be hard to create that exact criteria because of how broad the projects are. But to create those safeguards at the state level, is that something that do you think should be looked at? Because that to me seems like the logical step. If you have all these, if it's going in a million different directions, It seems like the only way to rein it in universally, keep it under control.
Right. Oh, definitely. But again, how do you standardize that kind of evaluation? On one sense, there are things that are going to be project specific. You don't want to write regulations that are so broad that people will be able to skirt it by saying, well, we have this exemption or that exemption, and this is why we weren't able to meet the targets. But you don't want to write it so narrow that you actually impede someone's ability to pull off a meaningful project. So it is a balancing act, but in general, I do think that, most state contracts do have built in a kind of tracking that you've actually completed the work that was proposed, but locally, no. Promises are made and often not kept, so that is an issue. But yeah, I don't know what the best solution is. It's about accountability, right? It's about us telling elected officials that we want them to do this kind of stuff and to pay attention.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But we do have, another topic that we're going to jump into here. Did you see this one? Did you happen to catch any part of this one? It's sad and depressing in a lot of ways. So since 1999, suicide rates are up around 30% across the board. It sort of fluctuates state by state. The Vital Signs report, which is where this was based out of, you can find it right on the CDC's homepage. It's super thorough, really interesting. So the part of it that stuck out to me was that more than half of those who died by suicide did not have a known mental health condition. It kind of, beyond the massive increase in numbers and in volume, it shows that we need more of the outpatient services, more of the awareness. We need to do what we can to reduce the stigma. We need to make the warning signs of suicide or mental health issues mainstream so that people without elaborate degrees understand what those warning signs are.
Yes.
Because this is something that pretty much affects everyone across the board, but really if you look at it in the sort of nuts and bolts fashion, you have to look at it and treat it and approach it the same way you would any other physical ailment or condition. And that starts with treatment. And I already mentioned treatment on the substance abuse side. These two issues go sort of hand in hand, where I think there just needs to be more attention, focus, and energy. And I realize that part of that means spending more money. Right. But these are two areas when you look at, because another part of this that I thought that I almost included in this segment, but I didn't want to get too off topic. I wanted to focus and give this the attention it deserved, was that Gannett actually released about a few days before this report came out. Gannett released the county by county statistics on fatal overdoses. Oh, I haven't seen that. And it showed, it basically broke down since 2013, year by year, what the numbers were. And if you looked at rural counties like Seneca, Schuyler, Yates, you would think that there wasn't much of a problem because the numbers were so much more, they seemed so much worse in Monroe County, in Onondaga County, and these places where you have urban centers. And if you just look at the data, and I tweeted this out and I talked about it on the radio last week, if you just go by the numbers, it paints this illusion that rural places or counties don't have the same problem, or the problem isn't as bad. With all of these issues, suicide, overdose, underreporting is the biggest issue. Yes. Yeah. Bar none. And to sort of have these broad numbers that don't go to sort of break down the nuance of how the reporting happens, it's really what the process looks like. It doesn't paint a fair picture of what the problem is. And that's where I really, really would stress to anybody who's representing the Finger Lakes or any rural part of New York State and Albany, really take a hard look at this. And I know session's over pretty much now, but really look at this next year. Really, really seriously look at this and consider spending some money in a place where it's desperately needed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add other than what you said. I mean, I think you've covered it. It's disturbing, and if this isn't like a call to action, I don't know what would be, because the report is clear and it is disturbing. I mean, the only thing I pulled out that maybe you didn't mention, but I think is worth mentioning, but I'm sure will be controversial, is that even though rates were up across all the states, they did note that in certain states, the rate of increase was lower, and that did directly correlate with the states that have stricter gun laws.
Right.
So New York State specifically was cited, along with Massachusetts, as having a decline or a reduction in the rate of increase of suicides involving a firearm.
Right.
So, that's important, I think. I think that's important to look at and to think about, particularly because that does affect a very specific demographic, which happens to be men. So I think it's something people need to be talking more about and seriously.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting and important was that the language public health crisis was finally being used to describe it, because when you talk about, how do you categorize an overdose to a fatal overdose to a suicide? How are you because those lines are blurred, and then you have the underreporting factor, and you have these. It's murky. It's very difficult to actually identify what is which, or which is what, rather. That said, though, I think using the phrase public health crisis is super important because it makes it very clear that this is not just a small, narrow problem. This is a universal one that everyone has to deal with, and one that is going to, and I hate to say it like this, is if you're one of those people who just doesn't want to talk about, the substance use disorder issue, or you don't want to talk about suicide, you want to sort of keep it tucked away, for whatever reason. This is costing everyone money. This is if you can get behind nothing other than the fiscal dollars and cents reasoning of this is costing every single state money that frankly should be spent on ensuring that it doesn't happen in the first place. So it's just, to me, it's one of those, it appears on the surface as a no-brainer. I don't think it's very often that we find legislation or issues that, that are no-brainers across the board. This is one of them, and I think it's a big opportunity. But I'm sure it's something that we're going to keep talking about and have to keep rehashing, because I'm not sure any elected official would be willing to risk the political collateral of the cost, the price tag that would be connected to really addressing it. But in Geneva, the beat goes on. So we have two items here to be talking about. Let's start with the contracts, and you can take it away and lead us through this discussion, because it's really interesting and, frankly, complicated stuff.
Well, yeah, I guess I was just kind of taken by surprise at the end of the last council meeting, when one of the counselors, Counselor Eddington, I don't know how else to characterize. I just kind of went to bat on behalf of a low bidder on a project for City Hall. But what was interesting is that it was couched in all of this language about concern about people's comfort coming to city council meetings, and issues of handicapped accessibility, which I have to say that it was interesting. It was kind of throwback, because the issue that first got me into city government at all was some comments that former Mayor Joanne Weiser, this is many mayors ago, made in response to the city managers at the time. The guy's name was Sanford Miller. Some Geneva people will remember him. But comments he made about not really seeing City Hall accessibility as an important issue. So to see that issue brought up again as justification for this bid was interesting to me. I think there's overwhelming agreement that all 3 floors of City Hall need to be made accessible, and adding an elevator will achieve that objective. What's at issue right now is how much more elaborate and involved the reconstruction of the back of City Hall should be. What else should be included in the elevator? And I was on the side of the position that was presented by Councilor Eddington at the meeting, that, as long as we're doing it, maybe we should bring City Council chambers back to City Hall, because City Council in Geneva meets at the Public Safety Building in the courtroom. So you have to go through the metal detectors down to the courtroom. And I thought I've always felt that was kind of a mixing of different public purposes. So do you really want to bring people to the police station for a public meeting? Do you really want to bring people into the courtroom? If people have had a negative experience at the police station or at the courtroom, can you really expect people to feel comfortable going back there just to talk about whether or not the grass at their neighbor's house is mowed, or their tax bill, or their water bill, or any issue of public interest? It just doesn't seem like the courthouse is the public square, that the courtroom is the public square. So, but for years and years and years, I was told that was silly, exorbitant, not necessary. And so over time, I think the Public Safety Building has become the place where City Council meets, for better or for worse. So I guess during the last budget process, a more elaborate proposal to redo City Hall was put into the capital improvement plan, with the constraint that it needed to be done for $2.5 million. So now the bids are in, and according to the comptroller, who I feel is a competent city employee who does good work, the total project, with all of the kind of various construction bids that need to be awarded to accomplish the goal, is about $700,000 over budget. So there is a way to remedy this. If the city says, you know what, hang on a second, there's a grant available for the elevator component to make the building ADA compliant. That is a grant funding source. The city applied for it last year and did not receive it, but they're going to apply again this year. The problem is, with most grants, you can't apply the funds retroactively. So if they award the bid right now and they start the work, they could apply for the grant, but even if they get it, they can't use the money on the project because they've already started the project. So it makes good sense that they would just take a time out and say, there's this $300,000 available. That's a big chunk of change, especially given the city's tax rate. Let's just slow down. We'll apply for this grant, and then we'll reevaluate the projects once we know if we've got that money or not. That seems reasonable to me. Apparently that does not seem reasonable to a couple of councilors. Councilor Eddington brought it up. Councilors D'Amico and Mayor Alcock attempted to push a vote on it, even though it wasn't on the agenda. Thank goodness the city attorney was sitting there and piped up and said, you can't do this. First of all, you're trying to amend a capital plan and a budget allotment from a capital bond. You need 6 votes of affirmative votes of council. That requires a supermajority. But even so, it requires public notice. Like, you have to have it on the agenda so people know what you're doing. So from a process perspective, I think everybody in the audience was just kind of taken aback that either they didn't know, although many of them have served on council for upwards of 10 years, so they should know, or they don't care about the process issue, informing the public, giving people a heads up about what they're planning to do. So that raised the question of why this rush? Why this vigorous advocacy? I mean, there have been so many issues in the city lately that people have been demanding a councilor speak up about, go to bat for them. And it seems like the one thing where a councilor's really going to bat for somebody, not the people, it's a contractor. So that I think that rubbed people the wrong way. So they are calling a special meeting, which will be held tonight, to talk about this issue. And at the end of the discussion, when they agreed to have this meeting, Councilor Eddington ended by, well, I hope someone will just call the low bidder and let them know that we're still talking about this, which, I'm sorry, it kind of reminded me of the kind of middle school chatter I overhear with my kids when they're like, hey, you need to call so-and-so and let them know I'm thinking about them. Just, it was funny. I don't mean to make light of it, right? It's a serious matter.
Right.
It wasn't handled correctly. But the way it was handled, I couldn't help but giggle a little bit.
So I guess playing devil's advocate like you did, timeliness of the project. How long has this been sort of stewing along, the modification of City Hall?
22 years.
Okay. So
I'm not sure the timeliness.
It's been going on for a while.
Right, yeah.
I can understand the frustration of any elected official who feels you're sitting through and you're watching a project or a process like this play out. It keeps getting stonewalled, or it keeps getting buried or forgotten or pushed to the side. At some point, I understand that desire to let's just get this across the finish line. Let's just get this done, whatever it costs to get it compliant, to get it set, whatever. Now, not playing devil's advocate, the conflict or the potential conflict, if there is one that exists between the counselor who went out of his way to go to bat for the contractor, if you're going to put it that way, I would hope that on the side of good governance, there would be repercussions for that. Or at the very least, enough voters in Geneva are paying attention.
Yeah, I definitely think people are paying attention. I mean, it's several people were talking about it yesterday who don't. I mean, I'm talking about not your typical politically active people. It's definitely the talk of the town. But, I appreciate your devil's advocate point about timeliness. I would just say that, to me, that just struck me as interesting because, the counselor who is now saying it is a matter of timeliness was part of the budgetary process as the Director of Public Works, determining what should be placed in the capital plan for those intervening years. And there wasn't this sense of urgency. So all of a sudden, it just strikes me as just an incredibly interesting change of heart that there was no other justification given for why all of a sudden now this is an issue that he cares about. So that surprised me.
So here's my thought process on that, and I'm definitely not going to bat for this counselor, but I've seen it play out over and over again where you have, because of these are not full-time elected representatives. They are not doing this as their primary function oftentimes. Maybe they're retired and they do this as like sort of a part-time time passer. But this whole, and it goes back to what you said about it was either a lack of knowledge about process or intent. I wouldn't be surprised if it were a lack of knowledge. I wouldn't be surprised if this were something that now is just finally getting the attention of a couple elected officials. We see it all the time. The Seneca Army Depot here in Seneca County sat empty for 2 decades or plus, and no elected official pushed to get any sort of economic development happening there. Now it's happened in about a span of a year and a half. But it just kind of goes back to this idea that we need elected officials, and we need to figure out, in my opinion, a way to make sure that elected officials can do their job fully and without sort of having these outside distractions from the task at hand. Because think of all the projects that while you were in office that would have gotten done if all of council were completely dedicated to nothing but council.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
And I think that is an excellent point, and I think that would be an absolutely fair and valid kind of justification for what's going on if the part-time counselor that we're talking about, who is a retiree, was not retired from a full-time position in the city governing exactly this topic. And so, that I think is what raises the question. I think the other counselors, sure, I mean, not the longtime counselors, they've been involved in this issue for a long time too. But the new people, you can kind of give a pass to and say, oh, this kind of took them by surprise. But I don't think anyone else who was really advocating this proposal can take the surprise defense with any credibility.
All right. So there was a second issue in Geneva that we're going to talk about, which is the one we've been talking about for months, and there isn't really a ton to talk about. But the city manager search is still happening. Has anything changed since the call for the process to be restarted? Or is that still, we still sitting on the wrong side of the curtain that's drawn?
Well, the only thing that's changed is that they've continued with the process, so some things have continued to happen. And they attempted to double down on the process being exactly the same as the process that led to the hiring of Matt Horn. People are saying, oh, well, we're using the same process and we got Matt, so we shouldn't criticize this process because we'll get someone equally good. But as was pointed out at the last meeting and has been pointed out time and time again, they are not following the same process. In fact, they have made several serious deviations from the last process, which means if what they're saying is that excellent process from before is what got us this excellent manager, I'm not sure what that means about using a non-excellent process, what that says about the person that will end up getting the job. I think what's disappointing is that at this point in the process, we still don't know any geographic diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity about the candidate pool at all. I mean, they've narrowed it down to 4, but they haven't even gone back and said, they should say we are down to 4 candidates. This many are local, this many are women, this many come from outside government, this many are from various, racial categories. They're not doing that. The least they could do would be to go back and say, of the original applicant pool, now that we've narrowed it down to 4, we can tell you we had X percentage of local candidates. We had this percentage of candidates who were women. We had this many candidates who have, a master's in public administration. They could at least go back and track the qualifications from the ad with the candidate pool. That would build legitimacy for the hiring process, because that doesn't give anything away about who the final 4 candidates are, even though I think at this point that would still be a valid thing to do. But it would show that they want to maintain communication with the public. Instead, they have taken this kind of black box process and wrapped it in another layer of,
Another black box?
Yes. I mean, I can't understand it. And it will be curious to see how the final announcement is made about who they select, because I actually don't expect that they'll give any more updates. Like, they're going to do in-person interviews, they said. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're going to talk about how many people actually come to town for those, because if you offer interviews, not everybody comes. I don't think they'll talk about how many people they're finally choosing from. I don't think they'll do a public introduction. I am just really, someone said I shouldn't be surprised, but I am. I am perpetually surprised, which shows that I've not given up hope in the city to be able to do things right. I just am constantly puzzled and disappointed by the fact that they don't do it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting process, and I keep coming back to the same thing. It's bizarre to a point of just there's not much you can say.
Yeah.
And we'll see how it pans out. And I guess, my thought process is whoever they select, I will be very curious to see what the reception is from the community. Right. I've already, that word, the words "not legitimate" have been used, I've seen on social media quite a bit to describe the process and the would-be candidate who becomes that person. That's going to be really hard. It's going to add to the difficulty of doing the job in the first place, because you're following in the footsteps of someone who was successful.
Right.
So, this council is not doing that individual any favors, and they may not even fully know what they're getting themselves into. I would assume that if you are, a candidate for this type of job, you're doing your homework about the community, just as the community should be doing their homework about you. But hopefully they are. But another topic, interesting. So Schuyler County is the latest to jump on the "we don't want an incinerator in our area" bandwagon, which pretty much has everyone in the Finger Lakes on it now. I have struggled to find anybody who has supported this. But the reason why I brought this up or wanted to talk about this was because I found it kind of surprising, and I thought you would understand this perspective. So Schuyler County has had two very differing approaches. So they've approached this incinerator as if it's something that is very wrong, but flipping the script on the Crestwood item is something that they have effectively refused to do.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Does that make any... Opposing this, to me, just doesn't make any sense. For them.
You mean given their history?
Yeah, for them, it just seems, if you are going to support Crestwood...
Right.
And then you're going to oppose the incinerator, if your philosophy is taking this... this truly objective stance on all issues related to economic development, which seem to be the argument, given that environmentally they're both terrible projects. It just doesn't. It shows that you're greedy and you want that to happen in your county, but if it's in another county, you don't mind jumping against it and making sure that it doesn't happen. Just doesn't make any sense, right?
You're right. The two positions are inconsistent. I'd love to think, here I go again being naive, I suppose. I would love to think it just signals progress in their thinking, that they're saying, wow, we were wrong and insular and misguided when it came to Crestwood, but we really see it when it comes to the incinerator. Environmental threat, you can't keep piling this stuff in our backyard and taking advantage of us because you think that we're a depressed community that won't object. I would like to think they've just seen the light. It would be great if they could now go back and address the Crestwood issue.
Why can't they?
They could.
Why can't they?
It would be wonderful.
If you go by just what has happened, it isn't dead technically.
No.
It's not gone. Why not address something that's in your own county before you start addressing items outside of your purview?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense.
Yes. I think everybody should be thinking regionally, so I appreciate that they're weighing in on it.
Yes.
But now they've got this opening, right, with Crestwood talking about how you're right, you got us, the caverns aren't safe, you were saying it, we denied it, but now you're right, we'll admit it. That would have been a great opening for Schuyler County to say, and you know what? Now we're going to say that we oppose it. Now that, but they didn't. So, I don't know, maybe they'll watch this podcast and they'll understand that they have done something that's inconsistent and they will correct it.
Maybe, or probably not.
You're right. I am too naive.
Let's talk about the downtown revitalization initiative. Seneca Falls and Newark were named finalists. That's pretty cool and interesting and exciting. Obviously, as the outsider, I'm curious what your thoughts are when you see the finalists named, given that you watched and lived Geneva going through this same sort of process.
Yeah. Well, all right. In full disclosure, if I had to pick, I would pick Seneca Falls, because I think that with the women's rights historic, national park, I think that is it fits all the kind of DRI objectives and criteria. So I think that would be a great pick. I understand Newark's got its Erie Canal Trail heritage, and that's a tie-in, and that's a compelling argument. But in the DRI, between these two, if I had to pick, I would pick Seneca Falls. That being said, Seneca Falls is not ready for this. I mean, their public processes for making decisions, I can't even imagine. I mean, if things came to fisticuffs between town board members over not $10 million, not a huge set of projects, I don't know what's going to happen if they get this money. It's kind of like when you think about people winning the lottery, right? There are some people you think could handle winning the lottery, and there are other people for whom you think winning the lottery would be a great personal disaster. Mm-hmm. I worry about Seneca Falls.
So I'm gonna.
Was that direct enough for you?
Yeah, this is gonna be a really unpopular opinion, I think. I am, and I say this with great appreciation for the effort that Seneca Falls, or certain individuals in Seneca Falls, the Seneca Falls Economic Development Corporation, the Development Corp, the efforts they've put forward. I don't think, comparing to the planning process and the execution, that Newark has, they have the receipts, as the young kids would say. They have the evidence. Like, it is clear that Newark has their game together, and I don't think it's even really a fair. This is almost like a heavyweight versus a lightweight competition. Yes, Seneca Falls has the history, but I don't think Seneca Falls I like what you pointed out in terms of just the public processes, but I just think in terms of documentation and listening to what then city manager Matt Horn said of the process and the paper trail that Geneva had to create to get to where they got, Seneca Falls is not there.
Yeah.
Newark has been there, and they've been in the news about being there. They have had economic development wins. They have significant infrastructure investments that they've made. They have made a very public effort to connect the Erie Canal to what they're doing downtown. And I just don't think that Seneca Falls has that same. Now, could they next year or the year after that? I think if Seneca Falls doesn't win this time around, I think they win next time around without any issue at all. Partly because this sort of interesting aspect of this whole DRI process is that I think there's a fairly limited number of communities that could even legitimately win in each region. Right. And now at this point, we're like, what, fourth year into the process?
I think this is the
third year.
Maybe it's the fourth.
When you get into like the fourth, fifth, fourth, fifth iteration, how much?
Right. Yeah,
how many are left?
Oh my goodness, we've got a lot of stuff still left to do. But that, I agree completely with what you're saying, and you're right. Like, I am looking at it just on kind of what DRI kind of is intended to do to a community.
Right.
But you're right, on the merits as far as being able to administer the program, to build on a set of successes that have been well implemented. You're right. It is Newark, hands down.
I mean, the town of Seneca Falls is literally being audited by the state comptroller's office. Think about that. They have been here since last fall, auditing the town of Seneca Falls and their processes historically for administering everything. And Seneca Falls is a finalist. I understand that maybe part of this is just sort of, a watered down field, or what the Seneca Falls Development Corp is doing to put Seneca Falls on the map. And I think what they're doing is real, but I don't think that what the town is doing aligns necessarily in the process side with what is necessary.
Yes, what a pragmatic and sensible approach you have taken, because I agree with you. If the DRI should not be awarded as an aspirational goal. So you're right. Seneca Falls can't get it. I've totally changed my mind.
I mean, I agree. Like, and the sort of the ironic, or I guess sad part is that, we could use that money desperately for a whole host of different things because there are events throughout the year that really highlight what Seneca Falls is all about, where thousands and thousands and thousands of people come here. Right. And it would be a great opportunity to really make downtown what it was a long time ago. And
you just got to get more of those people involved in the local governing, because I agree with you, but those are not those things that you're pointing to are not the things that the town board is overseeing and initiating, and the town supervisor.
So hits and misses. What are you looking at? I know me. I want to point out that yesterday I had Vinny Esposito of Finger Lakes Regional Economic Development Council on my podcast. The 30-minute conversation. If you have 30 minutes in the car, give it a listen. It was really interesting. He talked about sort of the urban-rural balance, sort of the misbranding that happens with economic development. In the Finger Lakes, because it doesn't encompass the Finger Lakes zone, does not encompass the true Finger Lakes, the real Finger Lakes, so to speak. Really interesting conversation, something definitely worth giving a listen to. But what have you got?
Well, I'm curious to see what's going to happen with Parrott Hall, which is it's a building on the National Register of Historic Places that the state took over long ago in order to turn it into some kind of museum, and then they never did it, so they've just let it deteriorate. Unlike this jail in Butler, they didn't put any money into it. Not true. At one point they did replace the roof, but it wasn't $350,000 a year to keep it operational, and now they want to tear it down. I think unjustly, right? They just need it off their books, and demolition they think is the cheapest way to do it. So it's interesting to see if the city will step up and step in and demand that the state give it to them along with the money that was budgeted for demolition, and let the city put out an RFP, make some of those funds available, and actually get that building back as a viable use. I mean, nationally registered buildings are not that easy to come by, right? There are strict standards. So once you take one down, it's not a one-for-one. You don't get one back. Right. So if they can do something, I think that would be excellent. I think there's a press conference tomorrow at 2:00 at Parrott Hall. So
very interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for this week's show. We'll be back in a couple weeks with another one. Thanks to our listeners and fingerlakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Let us know what's on your mind. Drop us a line at debrief@fingerlakes1.com. That's email. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. Stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we will catch you next time.